So recently I did my top 10 of 1995 video, and at the end of that I asked you guys if you would want me to do another year, and Jason Nike was the first one to suggest 1986. So that's exactly what I'm doing. This is my top 10 movies of 1986. I'm not going to do any honourable mentions for this one because I've not seen as many movies in this year as I did for 1995, and I will say I'm not as big on the 80s as most people. I'll just say that up front. But this is still a pretty solid year, and the 10 movies that I have here are all really solid movies. This is my top 10, not your top 10, so there's no need to get offended by my choices, but I would quite happily discuss them with you if you want to talk about them in the comments section, and also give me your own top 10 for 1986. But yeah, you know the drill. We start with my least favourite, we work my way to my favourite, and that is that. So let's get into it. At number 10 is Highlander. Now for the longest time this was my second favourite movie. There's another film on this list that was my favourite movie for quite a few years. But yeah, that and this were my top two until Batman came along in 1989. But yeah, Highlander, it's a cool concept. You know, this idea that there are these immortals running about having sword fights. They got to chop each other's heads off until there's only one of them and they gain the ultimate power. It's a bit weird. I don't know why a race would exist that does that. But yeah, before the sequels came along and turned it into some weirdness, it seemed like these guys were just human but had a power, and I preferred that to what we get in Highlander 2, which destroyed the mythology. But yeah, it's a good, solid action film. It's very 80s, really dated now, but it's got a great Queen soundtrack, and some of the action sequences are pretty good. It's a solid, tight story that doesn't overstay its welcome. And number 9 is Gung Ho, a film that I recently reviewed on my channel, starring Michael Keaton, directed by Ron Howard. It's just a really good drama / comedy about a culture clash between some Japanese businessmen and some American workers who come together to reopen a factory, a car making factory. And it's all about the differences between these two cultures and how they at first clash, but then ultimately work out how to occupy the same space as each other. It's funny, it's quite dramatic in some parts, it's got some really wonderful characters in it, and yeah, it was quite a feel-good movie for me. I really enjoyed it. I remember loving it as a kid. It took me a long time to go back to it, but I did recently reviewed it and it held up. It really did hold up. It's only got a 2.9 on Letterboxd, and I think that's unfair. So yeah, Gung Ho, check it out if you haven't seen it. Number 8 is Heartbreak Ridge. This is another film that I have reviewed on my channel at one point. It's directed by Clint Eastwood. I am a fan of him as a director. He also stars in it, and he plays a Marine. He comes in, he's there to train a bunch of Marines. It's basically, it's very much of the school of Full Metal Jacket, although I believe it was done a year before. Yeah, it was. Full Metal Jacket was 87, I think. So it's done a year before Full Metal Jacket. It's not quite as, as raw as that film. It goes more for humour, but it is of that ilk, of a tough sergeant who gives a lot of one-liners, really great one-liners to the people that he's drilling in order to beat them into shape. It doesn't quite have the social messages that Full Metal Jacket has. It's not quite as good as that film, but it did come out a year before it, and it is still very good, highly entertaining. Some really great character work in there, and Eastwood is on fire. And number 7 is Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. This follows the original crew of the Starship Enterprise as they travel back through time in order to save some humpback whales, to stop a probe in the future, or their present, from destroying the Earth. It's very much an environmentalist story. Those issues were quite big on the social agenda at the time. I remember that being very much a lot of what was talked about around that period. Save the whales and all this, that, and the other. But ultimately, it's just a really good story that takes the Star Trek crew, sticks them, out of their own time into our time, a time that we could relate to, but they could not. And it becomes this fish out of water story for each member of the crew. It's a lot more light-hearted than previous Star Trek outings, but all the better for it, really. It's just, it's a different beast. Compared to most other Star Trek movies, this is the one that kind of stands out as being somewhat different in flavour, but not necessarily... as I say, not necessarily worse off for it. It's amusing. I like all the character stuff in it. Everyone gets a moment to shine, and seeing them kind of put into 80s culture, you watch it today, it is a bit of a time capsule. It's very enjoyable as far as Star Trek movies go. I've always been a fan of certainly of the movies. I am a mild Trekkie. I'm not, I don't really watch the TV shows anymore, but I did watch them as a child. I would say I was a mild Trekkie. But when it comes to the movies, I was always pretty big on them. I watched the movies many times, and this was one that was on quite a lot as a child. We watched this as a family quite a lot, so I've got a lot of nostalgia for it. And number 6 is the Stephen King adaptation, Stand By Me. This is directed by Rob Reiner. And it's very good. I always have very distinct memories of watching this as a child and being totally engrossed with the characters, these 4 main characters, and feeling like they were very relatable. As a child going through bullying and things like that, I could relate very much to these 4 guys that we go on this road trip with, essentially. Not a car journey, but like a walking road trip. But they go off to find a dead body. It's not the most fun adventure, but as a kid watching this, you would have those kind of adventures where you would find something inane and go off looking for it, and obviously, like, when I was a kid, it never amounted to anything, but in this film it does. But it's really this adventure story about these kids going off and learning to really stand up to their demons, and become stronger people, stronger friends as a result of this adventure that they go on. It's a very character-driven story that is handled really well from all involved. And number 5, yes, it had to be on here. I'm sure those who know me were waiting for it. It's Critters, of course. This was, at one point, for a good 2 years straight, my favourite film. At the age of 9, 10, 11, it was my favourite movie. Critters. I watched this constantly. I had it on video, I wore it out, I taped it off TV, just one random night. I remember it being that film that I saw the video cover of in a video store, and I just always wanted to watch it. It was on, and then it came on TV, I taped it, and then I wore that tape out. I just, watched it non-stop. I would get home from school, and Critters would go on, and I would watch it again and again and again and again. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I still love it. It doesn't hold up quite as well, these days as it did back then, but it does hold up pretty well. Considering it's very low budget and considering that it was essentially just a Gremlins ripoff, it is better than Gremlins. I've got no embarrassment about saying that. I will defend that statement to my death. It holds together better than Gremlins. The internal logic is handled so much better. Yeah, I love the setting. I like the characters a lot more. I think the film has a lot more fun without being stupid, without going off on weird tangents that don't make any sense. Yeah, I love it. I love those little critters. They're great. It's a shame they've never quite been handled as well since, but I still have a lot of affection for the franchise. Number 4 is Michael Mann's Manhunter. This is an adaptation of the Thomas Harris book Red Dragon, which was later readapted so that this would fit in line with the Anthony Hopkins iteration of Hannibal Lecter. But this is really the film that started it all with regards to Silence of the Lambs and where that series came about. And I think it's great. It is the second best film out of all the Hannibal movies. I think the music has dated it a little bit somewhat. It's very 80s in tone, the music. But as far as the visuals, as far as the storytelling and the character work, the performances, I think they're all top notch. Michael Mann's direction, excellent. And it's really a film about obsession, about two men on opposite sides of the law who essentially are the same beast. They just have different outcomes because of their philosophies on life. It's a very good psychological thriller. And it plays with themes that Mann would revisit time and time again over his career. Number 3 is David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly. Speaking of a director revisiting themes that he's touched on throughout his career, body horror. This is a guy who loves to delve into the realm of body horror, and I don't think he's ever done it as well as he does here. This film is absolutely brilliant. We have this character, Brundle, who is this man again obsessed with his science, with finding certain answers in science, and unfortunately those answers reveal themselves in an experiment gone wrong, and the human being, the man, becomes the monster. And it's a tragic journey of seeing this guy who has a relationship with this woman, and seeing him just slowly decaying over the course of the film and becoming something that ultimately she would not be able to love. Cronenberg finds ways to keep this thing human even when it's become its most monstrous. It's quite a heartfelt film, really, for something that is filled with so much physical horror. But yeah, it's definitely one of the best horror films of the 80s, one of the best films of the 80s period. I think it's really great. Some of the stuff in it is gnarly as heck. I always remember the arm wrestling scene when the bone comes out. It's just like, But yeah, great stuff. Number 2 is The Hitcher, starring Rutger Hauer. I reviewed this film earlier this year along with Cody Leach. It's a classic. It's an absolutely brilliant film. It's been one of my favourite films for a long time. It's just so effective in what it does. It's quite understated. It's a very quiet film, but it lets the landscape that is being filmed kind of become part of the character of the film. This desolate landscape in which there's no one there to help, in which this man just constantly taunts this other young man, basically wanting him to stop him. He kills, he butchers, and does stuff that we never really see on screen. If our main character doesn't see it, we don't see it. A lot of what happens, it's all off screen. It's left to the imagination. It's a very effective thriller with really brilliant character work. Rutger Hauer giving a stellar performance that's up there with his Roy Batty performance. It's an absolute classic of the 80s, which was sadly remade terribly in the early noughties. But of course, my number one of 1986 is Aliens. This is a movie that sits quite comfortably in my top 10 movies of all time. It was very high up on our recent Sci-Fi 31 on the 31st, with good reason. I've talked about this film ad nauseum. I've reviewed it. It's been in 331 on 31s. It's now on this list. The best film of 1986, a film about motherhood. It's sci-fi, it's an action film, it's a horror film, it's a drama. It's just brilliantly character driven. It's James Cameron at his best. This and Terminator 2 are his absolute masterpieces. And there's not much more I can say on it, to be honest. As I say, I've talked about this film so much over recent years. But yeah, Aliens, my number one. That is my list. What is yours? Do leave yours in the comments section down below. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any suggestions for another year you would like me to cover on these top 10s, do throw it in the comments below as well. Yeah, again, thank you for watching this video, and until next time, cracking.